of Thank you for coming to the second session of the Social Reproduction Theory Lab, which has been generously sponsored by the Purdue University's History Department, where I work, and generously worked on by our kind research assistant, Bhattacharya Shahasri, and my co-collaborators, Susan Ferguson and Erin Jaffe. We have a regular series now, so you will have seen the announcements on social media. We also like to use the series to uplift other sorts of work on social reproduction theory, even if such work does not directly correlate to the kind of projects we are personally doing. So we would like to highlight some of those initiatives in this series. And if you are working on something, whether it's a book project, a grant, or a lecture series, please let me know at my Purdue email, which is on my webpage, and we will definitely make space for you and try to have a conversation in the near future. The purpose of this series is to further discussions on social reproduction theory, find common ground, and have a mutual understanding of the challenges involved theoretically and politically in doing this kind of work. So we welcome all and every suggestion that you may have, and particularly of your work. Having said all that, my name is Tithi Bhattacharya. I am a historian here at Purdue, and I am going to turn this series, today's meeting, over to my colleague, friend, comrade, Dr. Erin Jaffe, who will be introducing the next speaker. Before we do that, I just want to highlight that Susan Ferguson and I also run a book series for Pluto Press, the Social Reproduction Theory series. I encourage you to check that out. And if you have a manuscript on the subject, we absolutely want to hear from you. We've got a lot of exciting work already in the series, and even more importantly, we also have a lot of exciting work coming in the pipeline. So without further ado, please welcome my colleague, Dr. Erin Jaffe.
Hello, I'm Erin, and I'll be moderating for today, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session. We have for today Pedro Rey-Araujo, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. He's currently working on value form readings of social reproduction, social metabolism, and their associated social temporalities. His ongoing research has appeared in journals such as New Political Economy, Rethinking Marxism, and New Left Review. He's also author of Routledge 2021, Capitalism, Institutions, and Social Orders, The Case of Contemporary Spain. So before handing it over to Pedro, just a friendly reminder, we've got about 25 to 30 minutes for Pedro's lecture today, and then there will have significant time for your question and answer. I'll take questions via hands raised, or you may just write them in the chat. But for now, it's over to you, Pedro.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you very much all the organizers for holding me here and inviting me to share my views. I intend that the core goal of what brings us here is to achieve some collective sort of clarification of what's the stakes of social reproduction theory and what do we understand by social reproduction. So I'll focus my talk on just offer my view of what I think we should be understanding by social reproduction. By extension, what I think social reproduction theory should be a theory of. And I'll finish with some remarks on why I think that a value theoretic approach to social reproduction, or in other words, why a technical appreciation of value is relevant and why that matters for the study of social reproduction. For those who are already here in the first session and by Kirsten Munro, I feel there are several affinities or similarities between her project and mine, which I like to bring here so that they may help clarify where I'm speaking from and what's the whole contours of my project. Firstly, I do think that the study of social reproduction should be more firmly grounded, even more than it is, upon the Marxist tradition, and especially so upon the late Marx project of the critique of political economy, the contribution, the Grundrisse, and above all, capital. Which means that the reproduction of the whole social totality should be the starting point of when inquiring about social reproduction. And in terms of the famous distinction by Lafflet and Brenna between social and societal reproduction, I think that societal reproduction should be the starting point of analysis. Secondly, and relatedly, I think the term life-making practices, which is very much used in the social reproduction literature, should be problematized. Because in capitalist societies, what's reproduced is not just life in the abstract, but one specific form of life, one highly attuned to the requirements of capital. So that in capitalist societies, the reproduction of life and that of capital are but two moments within one and the same process. Thirdly, I think it is crucial to be attentive to the social form of labor. And I think social reproduction theory should be attentive to the social form of labor. What do I mean by social form? Every act of labor has the satisfaction of some social need as their ultimate goal. However, their relation to the whole world of social needs may differ, and by extensions, the conditions they must meet in order to actually reach that destination and then be sanctioned and validated as socially useful might differ as well. I think this must be had in mind. On the one hand, a transhistorical, flattened view of labor, which is oblivious to its necessary social form, must be rejected. But it is equally imperative not to presume that all labor acts in capitalist societies are equally capitalist. In this regard, the collective mediation of the social metabolism, where I understand by social reproduction, is internally factored relative to the social form bestowed upon its constituent labor practices. More on that after. For now, I just want to start what my core contention is, just to situate this discussion. What do I understand by social reproduction? In my view, social reproduction should be taken to be short for four terms: capitalist, social, human reproduction. Capitalist, social, human reproduction. In reverse order, that is starting from reproduction and finishing with capitalist, each of these four terms operates at increasingly lower levels of abstraction and introduces determinations upon preceding ones. Like human reproduction qualifies reproduction, capitalist social reproduction qualifies social reproduction, and so on. In this framing, the relation between social reproduction and capitalist production should not be understood as one between different social spheres, nor one between different social practices, but one between a transhistorical content, which should be the need of any conceivable society to reproduce itself over time, and one historically specific form, capitalism, which has adopted in human history. There have been others before, and hopefully there will be others after. Hence, social reproduction does not occur despite nor besides or capitalist production, but occurs precisely through it. In this sense, the reproduction of life, again, and that of capital are but two co-mediated moments within overall capitalist social reproduction, which I think should be the core object of study of social reproduction theory. Moreover, in capitalist societies, all labor practices are somehow implicated in the overall reproduction of the capitalist social whole, albeit are so to different degrees. So, whereas some of them might be external to capital, they're nonetheless internal to capitalism. Okay, so let's start with what I understand by social reproduction. Again, capitalist, social, human reproduction. I'll start with reproduction. Human beings are animals, and like every other animal, in order to exist, in order to be, they must reproduce themselves. And that is the most abstract and the most essential determination of earthly life. In this regard, like animals are heterotrophic beings, which means they must seek the energy they need elsewhere. Their reproduction involves the intake of energy and materials to be then converted within their bodies and then excreted in altered form. This process, which goes by the name of metabolism, is in short the most basic condition of earthly life, irrespectively of its nature. All these determinants human beings share with the rest of the animal kingdom. Every species has species-specific needs, as well as species-specific capacities to provide for them. That's what singularizes horizontally a species, what separates them from other species. And in order to do so, in order to provide for those needs, they must actively intervene upon their environment to transform it, that is, to give it a form liable to satisfy their needs. And this process has to be repeated periodically. Human beings share all these determinations with the rest of the animal kingdom, and that should be the starting point when inquiring about the social reproduction. What then singularizes human reproduction with the rest of the animal kingdom? In the German ideology, Marx and Engels wrote, I'm quoting, "The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the corporeal organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature," unquote. Both their continuity with the rest of the animal kingdom and the essential difference separating them from the animal kingdom must be sought, therefore, in the human being's corporeal specificity vis-a-vis the remaining species. What then is specifically human about human reproduction? Like any other species, and in this I'm following Joseph Frakia's Bodies and Artifacts, the excellent study, the corporeal organization involves both species-specific needs, that is, what they must produce, what to reproduce themselves, what they need, and species-specific capabilities, that is, how can they produce what they need. I'll start with needs. Again, in the German ideology, Marx and Engels wrote, I'm quoting, "The first premise of all human existence is that man must be in a position to live. But life involves, before everything else, eating and drinking, habitation, clothing, and many other things," unquote. What this eating and drinking, habitation, and clothing ultimately means is that human beings need a minimum amount of caloric intake to reproduce themselves, need to eat. They need a minimum amount of hydration to transport nutrients within their bodies. They need a minimum amount of sleep for the mental and physical restoration. They need shelter and clothes so as to maintain a constant body temperature. And moreover, because human beings have a limited storage capacity, providing for those needs, securing what they need, is never just a one-off event. Rather, it must be renewed periodically. It follows, therefore, that production is necessarily repetitive, that production is necessarily reproduction. On the other hand, human beings also have species-specific capabilities to provide for those needs, instruments and capacities that they have and that singularizes them as a species. Like, for instance, bipedality, which not only enables movement, but also the specialization of their hands, which together with opposable thumbs, they enable object apprehension, which in turn enables the liberation of their mouth from that function, which in turn grounds the strictly human capacity for sonic articulation and reception, which is imprinted in human language. Regarding all these, humans are not different from the rest of animals. I mean, what ultimately differentiates human beings from the rest of animals is not simply that they're different, that they're separate species like cats or elephant, but that the fact that their interaction with their environment is done not instinctively, as my cat does, but purposefully and consciously. This activity is what Marx refers to as labor. And this, what in the last instance, according to what the terms of Marx in the volume 1 of Capital, differentiates the word architect from the best be, the fact that we humans conceive before acting, or at least have the capacity to conceive before acting. Because this interaction is conscious and purposive, that is labor, the very process of satisfying needs is truly transformative. It transforms the outer environment to give it forms liable to satisfy our needs. It transforms the needs themselves in the process of their satisfaction, and by extension, they transform the very subject whose needs they are. Moreover, already from the determinants of the sheer biological reproduction, from the very act of giving birth itself, to the very long gestation period involving human pregnancy, to the very long, even longer period of infancy, human reproduction must be of necessity social reproduction. No human body can ever be reproduced in isolation, nor can its most essential potentialities, for instance, language, be developed in isolation. In short, there is no and there never can be individual reproduction which is not, at the same time, social reproduction. Robinson Crusoe can only exist in the imagination. These social relations, therefore, through which human reproduction is instantiated, are, however, infradetermined. They are not simply given. They must be reproduced alongside physical reproduction itself. It is one and the same process, the process of physically reproducing ourselves and reproducing the societies that help us reproduce ourselves. However, while these social relations are infradetermined, they can adopt myriad different forms, they must nonetheless satisfy two core historical requirements, which I understand as the content of social reproduction. These two historical requirements are as follows. On the one hand, there must be a division of labor. Human needs are multiple, per definition. So are the use values intended or capable of providing a satisfaction to them. And so are, by extension, the variety of concrete acts of labor capable of giving rise to those use values capable of satisfying those needs. Inasmuch as the available labor resources that any society has at its disposal is limited by definition, a division of labor must be enacted. It must be determined which activities should be undertaken, and also, relatedly, how much of the available labor resources should be devoted to each of them. Besides a division of labor, and intimately related to it, there must be a distribution of its products. A division of labor, by definition, gives rise to an ensemble of heterogeneous, incommensurable use values, which must then be distributed over the social body. How that distribution is done, how is it undertaken, is neither simply given. Through this distribution, not only must the sheer biological existence of each individual be reproduced, at least to a certain extent, but also the attributes enable them to carry out their specific roles assigned to each in the division of labor, as well as the social relations binding them together. In sum, to recap, a division of labor and a distribution of its products. Those are the sine qua non conditions of human existence, where I take to be the content of social reproduction, and there can be no society who does not provide some sort of solution to them both. However, how is that done is historically underdetermined. It can adopt many different historical forms, and capitalism is simply but one of these. So, capitalist social reproduction, where in the last of the four terms that I pointed out. What ultimately fights capitalist societies is not the existence of markets, nor wage labor, nor even capital. All of them have existed before capitalist societies came into existence. Rather, the most essential condition of capitalist societies is a comprehensive state of dispossession. In the words of Sorin Mao, in Mute Compulsion, a radical split between life and its conditions. In capitalism, reproductive units cannot fully reproduce themselves through what they own, through what they have at their disposal. Rather, they must sell a portion of their time, or more accurately, at least some of its members' portion of their time, to those owning the means of reproduction, in exchange of a wage, by means of which to acquire the means of reproduction in the objectified forms of commodities. Hence, in capitalist societies, only through a sort of strange detour can workers have access to the products of the labor which they had produced beforehand. In the turn, the owners of the means of reproduction do not engage in production in order to satisfy some specific social need, even if that's always of necessity a prerequisite of its production, but rather to secure a monetary profit in exchange. For them, satisfying a social need is merely a side effect. The more widespread, therefore, is the situation of dispossession, the greater the part of society's total labor that will adopt the form of wage labor, and by extension, the greater the share of the total use values involved in securing ongoing social reproduction will adopt the form of commodities. What then does the capitalist form of social reproduction consist of? The capitalist form of social reproduction, one historically specific form the process of social reproduction has adopted in human history, consists in myriad multiple private acts of labor, lacking any sort of overarching coordination, undertaken strictly independently of each other, which are only validated ex post. That is, they're only recognized by society as having effectively contributed to its own ongoing overall social reproduction. In the case, which is always uncertain and definitely never guaranteed, that they manage to sell their product as commodities in the market in exchange of money. If that is the case, again, which is always uncertain and never guaranteed, they'll be granted access to an adequate portion of the commodified social product in proportion to how much money they have in their pockets. In capitalism, despite lacking any sort of overarching coordination, the two core transhistorical requirements of social reproduction that I mentioned before, that is a division of labor on the one hand, a distribution of its products on the other, are instantiated through the incessant movement of value seeking self-expansion and the price oscillation that such movement brings forward. It is, in short, through the law of value that the both transhistorical requirements of social reproduction are instantiated in capitalist societies. In capitalism, because there is no overarching coordination, producers relate their acts of labor only indirectly through the relations established by things, by the products in the market. That's what Marx refers to as fetishism. The circulation of value, therefore, mediates the reproduction of social life. The reproduction of social life, in turn, is thus conditioned and subordinated to the reproduction of that abstract nexus holding it together, namely the circulation of value seeking self-expansion. The ongoing reproduction of the latter, of the circuit of value, is therefore both a necessary outcome and a necessary precondition of the reproduction of social life itself. However, and this is crucial, not all acts of labor are actually subsumed by capital. Not all acts of labor are capital. In this regard, social reproduction is internally fractured relative to the social form of its labor practices. To repeat, social form refers to the following: that every act of labor has the satisfaction of some social need as a necessary presupposition. However, how they relate to the world of social needs, and by extension, which conditions they must meet in order to reach their destination, starkly differ. On the one hand, we have non-subsumed practices, practices which are not directly capital. These are articulated through direct personal relations, like, for instance, if I wash my mother's clothes or if I cook dinner for my flatmate. They do respond to a predetermined social needs, like my mother's clothes were broken, my flatmate is hungry. Need comes first, labor comes after. These acts of labor are directly useful. Inasmuch as they respond to some predetermined need, satisfaction of that need is always a matter of degree, but in a sense, it is always guaranteed. I can be a better or worse cook, but my flatmate is going to be fed somehow. And also these practices are directly social. I cook because someone's hungry, that someone is going to eat my food. They don't need to be validated through the market. They do not need that detour. Subsumed practice, conversely, those that are actually capital, are not directly social, but private. And they're only socially recognized or validated as long as they manage to sell their products, which again is never guaranteed. Lacking any sort of coordination, they're not intended for anyone in particular, but for an impersonal other. And they're not intended to satisfy any predetermined social need, but rather to deliver monetary profit through the sale in the market. The effort that's been put is only socially recognized and validated if and only if products are sold in the market. They face, therefore, an all or nothing scenario. Either the product is sold and then the producer is rewarded accordingly, or if it's not sold, all that effort will be rendered totally useless. Because producers, they never know in advance what the market conditions are, and they confront uncertain and impossible to predict in advance standards of productivity, their very social form already imprints upon them a compulsion to improve, to accelerate, to ameliorate, to do things differently and better. They must beat their competitors. It is, therefore, the relation to the world of social needs, not any intrinsic feature of the tasks themselves, that causes this. I think the example of cooking might clarify this. Every act of cooking has as its most ultimate purpose just to satisfy someone's hunger. Someone needs caloric intake, so we cook, we elaborate products, we give it a form liable to satisfy human hunger. However, depending on the social form, things might vary. If I'm cooking for my flatmate, I respond to a predetermined social need. She is hungry. I need to cook for her. I can be more or less skilled. I can have more or less time. I can be better or worse at it. The quality of the food will definitely differ, but more likely she will be fed. If instead I set up a restaurant, things slightly differ. All the time that I spend cooking night in order to be sold tomorrow as commodities will be dependent on whether I manage to beat my competitors or not. Let's say whether I manage to sell a menu for 15 euros a meal. If I do, I will be regarded accordingly, and that all the effort I put will be validated by society. But if I don't, all that effort will be useless. So from this all or nothing scenario already springs the compulsion to improve, to accelerate, to ameliorate that qualifies social form of capital. Then that's precisely what value denotes. And that's precisely what the status of practices being value producing or non-value producing ultimately signals. I'll conclude or start my conclusion by pointing out what I think that value does not denote, what I think that value does not mean, and to then conclude where I think that value is relevant or what does value signal. In short, I think that value does not denote any sort of degree of political relevance. Value does not denote or mean any different degree of essentiality, nor does it refer to a specific set of practices, nor does it refer to specific different spheres. I'll start with political relevance. I think this is a traditional autonomous position, already from its earliest iterations in the Wages from Housework campaign till the present, that in order to further the political demands of those subjects that have been traditionally assigned to those non-subsumed practices, they argue that their value-producing character must be asserted as strictly as a means to further the political demands. Silvia Federici, in a recent 2019 Radical Philosophy article, makes this position explicit. I'm quoting her. To deny the productivity of unpaid work activities is to assume that much of the world population is irrelevant to capital accumulation, which means that it cannot make the claim that the wealth that capitalism produces is also the fruit of its labor. I contend that this sort of political voluntarism has absolutely nothing to do with Marxism. Being value-producing for Marx is not something good. Indeed, Marx himself stated in Capital, I'm quoting, "To be a productive worker is therefore not a piece of luck, but a misfortune." Value does neither refer to different degrees of essentiality or relevance for the reproduction of the whole social totality, and this argument can easily go both ways. On the one hand, there might be some orthodox Marxists that could argue that market-mediated activities, or maybe value-productive activities, are more important or essential for the reproduction of the social whole or for the reproduction of overall social life. While some in the Marxist feminist tradition would argue for its exact opposite. That is, it is actually those activities that go mostly unpaid, those so-called narrowly understood reproductive activities that would be more essential to the reproduction of life. According to them, in short, reproduction would deliver or produce people, whereas production would merely deliver stuff. Value does not refer to this. Thirdly, it does neither refer to a specific set of practices, as it were something intrinsic or inherent to the practices themselves. Rather, presuming that practices are, by their nature, either productive or unproductive, like caring for children is unproductive and working in a mine itself is productive, implies adopting a transhistorical view of labor, which is oblivious to its necessary social form and all the determinations that comes with it. There is never and there can never be labor as such, labor in the abstract. Labor always has a social form. Presuming that value just denotes ex ante some specific set of practices, therefore means being oblivious to a relation between a practice's content, that is, its qualitative specificity, its particular content, the result of which is a particular use value, liable to satisfy some specific social need, and the social form it contingently and contextually acquires, which determines in turn how those acts of labor relate to social needs. In short, any labor practice can be productive or unproductive. It only depends on the social relations embedded in it. Lastly, value does not refer either to a different spheres. And I think this is a position that is most familiar to social reproduction theories. I know it's a very nuanced position, but because the distinction between productive and reproductive domains, even if upheld, is held to be the form of appearance, merely the form of appearance of capitalist social relations. The distinction nonetheless is maintained. It is implicit, I think, in retaining this reading as spheres that production and reproduction exist somehow as separate, and whose most prominent link would be found in the reproduction of labor power. Relatedly, this view also enables the contention that reproduction provides the condition of possibility of capitalist production. And I think this would be Nancy Fraser's position, among others, for instance, missing the extent to which the opposite holds to, the extent to which capitalist production actually provides the condition of possibility of social reproduction, narrowly understood. It therefore misses the fact that the abstract reproduction of capital and the concrete reproduction of life are not two different things, but actually two co-mediated movements within one single process, namely overall capitalist social reproduction. So, if value does not refer to neither political relevance, nor degrees of essentiality, nor sets of practices, nor different spheres, what does value denote? What does value refer to? It merely refers to the social form that acts of labor are bestowed upon, contextually and contingently. To recap, every act of labor has a necessary presupposition of their undertaken the satisfaction of some social need. However, their social form varies. It must vary. Whether practices are ultimately productive or unproductive of value refers therefore to this form they contingently and contextually are bestowed upon and which they adopt, which signals exclusively how they relate to the world of social needs and by extension, which criteria they must meet in order to effectively reach the destination, and by extension, to be recognized or validated by society as having been indeed socially useful. Those practices which are subsumed by capital are neither inherently different, nor more essential, nor definitely not more politically relevant than those that remain beyond capital's own accounting schemes. Rather, the singularity resides in the fact that they become autonomized into a self-referential system of abstractions, ultimately and constitutively unresponsive not only to social needs, but to any socially determined criteria. Many other activities involving securing social reproduction on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis remain articulated through direct relations of personal dependence. They are another to capital, but they're nonetheless internal to capitalism. The task, therefore, is not a matter of valorizing just one single part of a violent, irrational, and ultimately self-destructive totality, but rather of abolishing capital as the core social logic orchestrating social reproduction in order to hopefully submit the latter, that is social reproduction, to collective, self-sustaining, and democratic control. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that very, very sharp and theoretical, precise ground clearing and series of explanations, Pedro. I think that was a highly enriching talk. So I'm going to open the floor now for questions. I hopefully can see if your hand is going to be raised if I get the right view here. But please do feel free to put any of your questions in the chat as well, and I'll be happy to read them out loud. And don't be shy, anybody. Maybe you're typing your questions. Maybe I'll start very briefly. I have a question regarding what the social form of labor is related to, or what more precisely it dominates. And let me try to phrase it this way: if value refers to social form of labor, whether something is subsumed, whether the condition for its social confirmation of its usefulness is related to value expansion or not, seems highly relevant. But I feel a lot of pressure to do my non-subsumed work really quickly. I feel a lot of pressure to like spend a little bit less time cooking for my flatmates or to do laundry a little bit faster because of all the other stuff that I also have to do. And so I'm just wondering, I mean, it seems like there's a kind of division there in whether the social form of labor applies to one, you know, avenue of being socially confirmed or not. But I guess I saying I kind of feel it bleed from one form of being socially confirmed into another because of how it, at least psychologically, how it influences my time, how it influences the way I relate to my tasks themselves. So I'm just wondering if that makes sense to you, or if you see some sort of like bleeding over of value form in kind of dominating my relation to my labor, whether it's confirmed via value expansion or not. And then I see Tithi has raised your hand, Tithi. Let's get Titi's question, and then if anybody else wants to, I'm still scanning, and then we'll give Pedro a chance to respond.
Thank you, Pedro. And I echo Aaron's sentiments about it giving us a lot of food for thought, and thank you for doing that work. My question is this. I would like you to perhaps clarify for us how the production of non-living commodities is related to the production of labor as a commodity. So what kind of contradictions, what kind of confluences and challenges do you see between the two processes, but also what do you see as the relationship between the two processes? It's sort of related to Aaron's question as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for both questions. I'll start with Aaron's, which I take to be how do those practices which are not subsumed relate to those that are subsumed? How do the practices that I do at home, for instance, relate to those of value? The fact that they're not themselves capital, the fact that they're not submitted to those imperatives, to those need to compete, to beat dynamic standards of productivity, etc., does not make them external to a capitalist society. And I think the fact that all those individuals undertaking them or receiving them are, at the end of the day, part of the social of capitalist society affects both the content and the times of occurrence. Like, for instance, if I'm not bringing a children, I can honestly take care of her. I can like look the better for her. But in the end, if they are my children, I need to be mindful that at the end of the day, they will be needing to sell the labor power in the market. So I need to have their employability in mind. So it's not innocent, the fact that I'm involved in a capitalist society when I'm doing all those activities. And I'll say that more crucially, the terms of occurrence of how I do carry out all those activities are conditioned by my involvement in the market economy or in value producing activity. Like, again, with the same example, if I have some children I have to take care of, I can only do that when I'm not at work. I can only do that with the energy and with the energy that I'm left over after I've been at work. I can only do it with the commodities that I managed to acquire while I was at work. So when I'm caring for them, I also have to prioritize my involvement to paid employment because I need the money to acquire everything I need to take care for them. However, when I'm taking care of my children, I'm not submitted to these dynamic standards of productivity. I'm not beating anyone. I can do things better or worse. I think satisfaction of their needs is always a matter of degree. But again, that's part of the same social totality. So it is affected through and through from the beginning to the end. Relatedly to what Tithi just asked, like how is the production of living labor related to the production of commodities? I think it's not incorrect, but the emphasis of social reproduction theory has been mostly put on the reproduction of labor power, which is one moment. I would be willing to concede like the key moment, but definitely not the only one. And life and value life is at both ends of the reproduction of value. both in terms of producing labor power, producing workers to be then exploited and to be then bestowed the social form of labor, but also at the same time as realizing commodities, as buying the market. Like in families, we're not only providing labor power, but we also providing consuming capacity of those things that we have hitherto produced in the production process. And also, I'm thinking of debt at the moment. Like, our life is also key to sustaining a key social relation in capitalism, which is social relations of debt. So we are immersed by value all throughout, and the very possibility of us reproducing ourselves reproduces value relations, and we cannot do otherwise. But at the same time, in order for the abstractions of value to be reproduced, we need to keep on being existing. We need to keep on being living. So in the end, they're both like two co-mediated processes, like two sides of the same coin, which is overall capitalist social reproduction. We need to reproduce life. Without life, there is no capital. But also in capitalist societies, without capital, there is no life. There is no way we have of coordinating ourselves. There's no way they have of distributing tasks among ourselves. There's no way we have to distributing what we have produced without reproducing capital and money and commodities and all the value forms in the end.
Okay, thank you. I see a comment in the chat, which I'll read aloud. It's by Sirisha Naidu. Sirisha writes, to add to Aaron's question, social needs themselves are influenced by capitalist forms of control, needs being socially determined.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, all our needs are produced transformatively and dialectically, but through our involvement in a capitalist society where capitalist value is constantly in motion, but there are many other relationships, many other activities, many other dimensions to be taken into account. But in the end, what I'm just trying to contest is that presume autonomy between both domains, which in certain currents of Marxist feminism literature is more extreme, and some others is way more nuanced, like in social reproduction theory, of course, but it nonetheless retains this sort of externality, which I think must be problematized and complexified. Our very needs, even if they retain a certain degree of autonomy, they're nonetheless conditioned and affected by our collective need as proletarians to sell our labor power. So we cannot just need or desire or want whatever we like without losing sight that the day after or the week after or the month after, we or someone we relate to must sell the labor power to an alien power.
So the floor is open, and maybe I'll take this opportunity, and I really don't mean to dominate, but it's just if nobody else is raising their hands. This seems like a classically Marxist reconstruction of social reproduction theory and a very fine grounding. And that leaves me wondering where revolutionary potentials can be theorized as a part of social reproduction. I take it that a part of our task as being social reproduction theorists is to understand the depths and the despairs of capital and the value form and the way that that contorts or controls or co-determines and mediates so many different fibers of our being. But I take it another part of our task as social reproduction theorists is to try to theorize the locus's opportunities, privileged standpoints, however you want to run the thought, of what resistance and hopefully ultimately transcending in revolutionary upheaval, replacing the law of value with a different model of social organization. So I'm wondering where, if anywhere, in your model here that you've provided for us, Pedro, you see political will coming from. Like, where should we look to find that?
Thank you. I was like, what should be the tasks, the political tasks, and then where that will might spring from. I think the task at a very, very abstract level, as abstract as at the level I've been speaking from, is that we should try to secure as much from social reproduction from the groups of capital to be coordinated and undertaken through conscious, collective, horizontal, democratic means. The less that we depend on commodities, the less that we depend on cellular labor power to get away to buy stuff, the better. In the end, the problem is with capitalism is that our social mediation is out of control. Nobody's in charge. I mean, obviously there are people who are more in charge than others and who have more power than others. But at the very end, that's what's very threatening and worrying about capitalism. There's no one in charge. Like nobody can actually have full control of it. That's what we might be leading towards self-destruction without nobody being able to just pull the brake. So like at the very abstract level, the less we depend on it, the more the use values involved in our social reproduction are reproduced, undertaken, produced, coordinated, not through market mechanisms, but through horizontal, democratic, collective relationships, the better. Where does the political will to undertake that? I wish I knew. I guess that experientially in my day-to-day life, everybody has a feeling of alienation, of lack of control, of having to understand, to go through working conditions they do not control, they might detest. How does that coalesce into a political subject capable of undertaking the transformations that are required to abolish the value form social reproduction? I have no idea. Sadly, I know how to organize at a very local level through very concrete, specific means. How to scale that up to a planetary level, where actually the rule of capital is instantiated. I like to say that's something we'll discover through collective practice, but I'm sadly lacking the answers to it.
Right, so once again, I'm going to call on Tithi Bhattacharya, but please, friends, comrades, we're organizing this for everyone involved. If you have questions, concerns, just comments, do not be shy. But go ahead, Tithi.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron and Pedro. So I want to push you a little bit on that, Pedro, and ask you this. You said the more we wrest control through horizontal, collective, local organizing, and I guess you're talking about decommodification to a certain extent and so on, of tasks, work, and other things, the better it is for us, right? So of course, we agree. We demonstrate for public schools, public hospitals, public parks. We try to do that to talk about food distribution, etc., etc. However, my understanding of accumulation process and value is that this sort of work, while essential and necessary, is absolutely and expressedly so temporary, because the motion of capital is to recommodify what has been decommodified, to reinsert into the cycle what was once outside of the direct production limits and so forth. So the way I understand Aaron's question of political will is this, that the decommodification work, the local or national or even international organizing that we do, is not so much to create a good life that will last, but to actually build up political muscle for future struggles, right? To kind of build up the connections, the networks, and the consciousness, and scale those up for other battles with capital, rather than, and here I think you are echoing for me that something that Federici says all the time, that the point is to unplug from capital. But I do not believe one can unplug from capital within capitalism. But I do believe we can build up the political will to escalate at every stage and disrupt capitalist production. So that I'll just leave it there.
So I'm going to read a comment from Esha Jaswal in the chat, and I'll call on Sarisha, and then we'll have Pedro respond. So Esha Jaiswal in the chat writes, do you think that the political will could maybe start emerging through the Industrial Reserve Army? And Sarisha?
I want to go back to actually not go, stay on the question of political will, because the way I understand Federici is in fact that, and perhaps also some of the initiatives in the US and elsewhere, where, so for instance, mutual aid, you can have mutual aid, which is just about helping each other, or you can have mutual aid in the form of, political, a conscious political decision to unplug. So I think even as we are talking about unplugging, I think that there might be, and the recommodification. So in some ways, I'm kind of not even a question for Pedro, but sort of a conversation, perhaps, following up on Tithi's comment, is that, like even the unplugging and in the resisting of the commodification or the recommodification, I think that the unplugging, when it becomes part of a political will, as opposed to when it becomes trying to create more space within the structures of capitalism. And so to Pedro, then, what do you see as, the way out is like, I suspect I know what your answer may be, Pedro, but just to clarify that, because there are two different ways of creating space for social reproduction that responds to the needs of people as opposed to sort of a byproduct of capitalism.
Well, thank you, Sirisha, Tithi, and Isha. I'll start with Tithi's and Sirisha's point. I do think that the unplugging is definitely not an option, or even if it might help. Like if in our community we didn't have to, we had some access, some source of food provisioning, or collective childcare, or some sort anything involved in reproducing ourselves that's not mediated by commodities, that's better. Although I'm very well aware that capital is always internally confronted with overaccumulation problems, so it's always ceaselessly seeking for new outlets. So the pressure in there might be unvariable. I guess on the one hand, I would say like there has to be some combination, some local initiatives. Like if a community can produce food for themselves, not market mediated, good, but that's not enough. You also need executive power of the state. Like you need to take control of transport avenues. You need like coordinate like wider scale processes, which are simply inconceivable at a local scale. Once you start considering the possibility of taking up the state, that it means that you have to confront the problem of the capitalist nature of the state, the fact that the state has to reproduce the conditions of capital accumulation through the transition, the fact that the state is inherently repressive, the fact that you're living in a wider geopolitical order where there will be threats from all over. But both dimensions need to be taken into account, even if as unlikely or impossible they might look right now. What I'm thinking mostly also is like which demands can be more easily scaled up. Like for instance, I'm thinking the issue of fighting for shorter working time. Fighting for shortening working time at the same time that it builds up a constituency for a concrete, specifically like narrow demand that can actually have a direct impact on people's lives. It also builds up or grants a horizon of a new life that might be worth fighting for. It also, by securing time free from the grips of capital, it enables the possibility of the developing of the social relations not mediated by commodities, of developing relations that might be potentially solidary or horizontal, which might grant a political subject in the future capable of scaling up that struggle. So even if like liberation from capital cannot be attained within capitalism, that I agree with, we cannot be elsewhere. Like we must operate within capitalism at the beginning. So like which sort of strategic demands might help us improve our chances both in the present and in the future? Like in terms of time, not only securing for a shorter working time and ask for more once it's attained, but also try to collectivize reproductive units from communal kitchens, communal creche, introduce statutory limitations of working hours. wholesale, widespread privatization that enables alternative social relations to blossom, not necessarily mediated by the commodity or the value form. I think that's more easily attained, although the struggle is never ending. Like there's never going to be a point when we're going to say, yeah, we reached there. The struggle is over. There's always like capitalism, even if we manage to push it to the residues of social life, it always will have this sort of corrosive effect. So I don't know whether it's possible to say like the battle is over. And that's what I think regarding the unplugging. So in short, yeah, it's necessary, but that's not enough. You need unplugging at the local, also at the statewide level, and in between to set up demands which build up a constituency for scaling up the struggle. And relative to whether I think the industrial research army could emerge from the political will, I would say like, yeah, the outcast or the underdogs or the unemployed will necessarily have to be part of that newly emerging political will to be, if you want, but that's not in like we cannot place all our bets in one single location in the social structure. Like even capital traverses us all, even those that we are reproduced through it, or all those that are marginalized or excluded. And anything that does not involve a very wide coalition of interests in different social locations will undoubtedly fall short of the revolutionary stakes at present. Sadly, as it sounds, but I don't see any way forward just for focusing on one specific location, whichever it is.
Anybody? Well, Carolina, please. I think you're still muted, Carolina.
Oh, thank you. A message appeared here and I wasn't sure. First, Pedro, thank you for your lecture. I have one question, more theoretic maybe. Could you please further explain what you understand by the impossibility of a transnational concept of labor? Is it more tied to a critique of value perspective, maybe, in which the very concept of labor is impossible under outside of capitalism, or maybe it means that labor is always specific to the historical period in analysis? This question came to me also because of the idea of the commodification, which reminds me of some of the tactics and strategies that the critique of value talks about. And yeah, it's more a theoretical question and distinction, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. I think what I said is like what I criticize is a trans-historical view of labor, which what I mean is like what I was criticizing is the understanding that labor is always the same irrespective of its social conditions. So like that every act of labor is just transforming of nature or just to satisfy some social needs. And what I argued that we have to be attentive to is the social form of it. That is, which social relations embed that act of labor. And there is never like labor as such. It's not the same. That's what I said before about cooking. Like cooking at a very abstract level in terms of its content is always like transformation of food raw materials in order to give it a form liable to satisfy our hunger. However, one never just cooks. One always cooks within historically specific social relations. So it's not the same like me cooking for myself, cooking dinner for myself, even than cooking at a restaurant. The relation of cooking always presupposes that someone's hungry, but that someone who's hungry is never at the same location. It's never the same place, then there is never the same sort of social relations that bind me to that other who's hungry. So if we are attentive to the social form of labor, then we can see which are the different determinants or conditions that affect how that labor is undertaken and which ultimate purposes it responds to. Like, it's not the same me cooking for my mom because I love her and there is a personal relation between us, that me cooking at a McDonald's for a very low pay with an unknown boss and with the threat on top of me that I might be fired the day after if I don't do 200 hamburgers an hour. Both of them are cooking, but because of their social relations in which they're embedded, the actual shape of that cooking differs. And that's where I don't know if I clarified where I said before, but that's what I had in mind.
Anybody? I don't. Okay, I'm wondering. I think that I guess I'll just try to ask the last question, and then if everybody wants to chime in, we'll have an opportunity after this one. I've been trying to think about the way in social reproduction theory we reproduce labor powers, not just concrete or specific moments of labor. And I'm wondering if the social form that you've been discussing today, Pedro, the value form, inheres in labor powers themselves, or if you would rather think of it, if that's too metaphysical a construction, or if that's too abstract a construction, right? But does the social form or the value form appropriate to capital inhere in and as our powers themselves, which can be actualized cooking for the flatmate or then cooking for McDonald's, right? In other words, is the problem even deeper? And then it forms the very ground of our labor powers or what could be exploitable under capital.
Yeah, I really like your work on that, and that's what I had in mind when I work. When I think of how labor power is reproduced from a social reproduction theory lens, I'll say like this: the way that labor power is reproduced is never labor power in the abstract, but when I'm thinking like child rearing, for instance, any parent that is mindful not only to take care of the future employability of their descendants in the future, which that already conditions the content of the upbringing you provide. As I like, you have to teach them how to be docile or how to receive orders or how to acquire content, how to be mindful or well educated or to provide a good behavior toward their superiors, etc. Like all these disciplines that have to be embedded in that upbringing of labor power. Not only that, but also the how you do that, again, you can only do that by help of commodities, which already have the form itself of a commodity. It's not just one product. It's just that one product that's being intended for sale, and that's what you have at hand. You can only have access to them. You can only acquire them through your wage, which means that you also have to be mindful of your own employability in the present and in the future in order to be acquiring those same commodities that will help and contribute to the upbringing of your children, etc. So like the whole process at many different stages is like tainted, is like affected, painted by the fact that it occurs in a capitalist society. There is sadly no location which is innocent or that takes place externally to the rule of capital. But it's also equally false that everything is capital. Like, no, not everything is capitalist. There are different degrees of dimensions. When I'm working for my employer, I have to do what I have to do. When I'm cooking for my children or for myself, I have a wider scope, though that scope is not unlimited, as like some autonomous visions might argue. Is whether it's more narrow or more wider, the scope of variation we have is obviously contextually specific. Like me as a highly educated white male in a Western country have a great level of leeway and of agency in determining all these things than some others which happen to be more unfortunate than I am. But even me, in 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, I'm forced to keep on selling my level power. So I cannot get wasted drinking alcohol today because my employer will gonna fire me. I cannot just play basketball instead of keep on reading books because I need to keep on selling my level power, etc., etc.
Well, thank you so much. And this has been really informative and theoretically clarifying and enriching. Thank you for joining us today, Pedro. And thank you everyone who has made it to the end here for being a part of this second part of SRT Lab. Just a quick advertisement for the third part, which we'll be having next month. Pramila Nadasan is going to be joining us on March 12th at the same time, and you'll receive a confirmation of that probably via Vipanchika shortly beforehand. But once again, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you in particular, Pedro, for the talk today.
Thank you for inviting me. A pleasure and an honor to be part of this.
Have a good rest of your day, rest of your Wednesdays, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Aaron.